few things can be more empowering to a young person than to say, I have confidence in your ability to make decisions about your life. And that when you make mistakes, which you will because you're human, an adult in training, that you'll be able to figure out how to clean up that mess and make it good enough.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to the podcast. It's been pretty rainy here in Southern California where I live. You might hear a little pitter patter in the background of this recording, but I think the rain always puts me in a very reflective mood. And appropriately, I have a really reflective guest joining us today. His name is Ned Johnson. He's the author of several books and the founder of PrepMatters, which is a company that does a lot of the same things that Signet does. They're just based in the Washington, D.C. area. So one of the reasons I asked Ned to join me on the podcast was really to talk about his first book called The Self-Driven Child. The subtitle is The Science and Sense of Giving Your Kids More Control Over Their Lives. And it's a fantastic book. I recommend it to people all the time. And in it, he's partnered with Dr. Bill Stixrud to talk about both the science behind and the more practical parenting tactics behind how to raise a kid who has agency and take some ownership of their lives. And I think it has come out at a very interesting time when we see, there's this huge mental health crisis in our teens. We had, of course, COVID that complicated things. And we see that there is just this rat race towards college and so much burnout in our teenagers. And alongside of that, because we want to protect them, we want to take care of them, we want to support them, parents are more involved than ever. And sometimes that's not a good thing. Sometimes we need to let our students struggle a little and feel ownership of their own challenges. Of course, we're not abandoning them, but we need to know where to draw that line. And I think his book is a really amazing resource for learning how to do that. So have a listen, and I'll see you on the other side of the interview. Ned, it's always so nice to talk with you.
Hey, Sheila. That's great to be with you.
I'm hoping we can start a little bit with, what you do. And then I always love to hear about the educational journeys of anyone I have on the show. So I'd love to hear about that too.
The Marvel origin story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Test geek, give me a cape. Yeah, so my name's Ned Johnson. I am the founder and test prep geek, as I describe myself, here at a company called PrepMatters. We do a lot of the work that's similar to what Sheila and your fabulous colleagues do. And we're just down here in DC. So my night job outside of doing test prep and leading the small company is I'm co-author of a couple of books with a friend of mine who's a clinical neuropsychologist, a book called The Self-Driven Child, The Science and Sense of Giving Your Kids More Control Over Their Lives, and a follow-up to that book called What Do You Say? How to Talk with Kids to Build Motivation, Stress Tolerance, and a Happy Home. And we got at this. Bill and I have been friends for a decade anyway. He is a clinical neuropsychologist, me in my test prep geek role. We're seeing, well, actually started out lecturing at a bunch of schools about how do kids develop healthy motivation, meaning intrinsic motivation that's not born out of fear, and really a sustainable model of motivation. And somewhere along the line, he said, it seems like it might be worth writing some of this stuff down. And he asked, he said, does it feel to you like there's kind of a unifying theme of all the stuff that we write? And I paused and I said, I do. It seems to me that everything that we talk about is designed to increase a kid's sense of control. And we started digging into this, and it turns out a sense of control is good for everything: academic success, career success, mental health, physical health, freaking longevity. And we think about a sense of control in kind of two domains. One, the subjective sense of autonomy of this is my life, this is my choices, because it's really hard to be motivated for things, for other people's goals for you. And the second sense is really the brain state that supports that, meaning that when we're in our right minds, the prefrontal cortex and all those executive functions run the show, as opposed to kind of runaway stress response of a kind of a hyperactive amygdala. And we really have approached this work because of the two really epidemics that we saw in young people of either mental health issues, stress related anxiety, depression, or and dysregulated motivation, either kids who are obsessively driven and would kind of sacrifice everything, including their mental health, or kids who figure if I can't be top 10%, well, chuck it. Why even bother? And both of these are problems. And certainly, Sheila, in the work that you do, like as do I, that while we're trying to help kids be academically successful and get really good opportunities for college where they can learn and develop themselves for the next 4 years of their life, I think that all of us, if we're honest, should really accept the fact that the most important outcome of high school and adolescence is not where you go to college, but the brain that you develop and carry into college if you go at least into your adult life. And so this is really our mission on trying to help parents and educators and young people themselves approach high school and adolescence as really a brain development process from which you can then build a successful life rather than sacrificing everything on the altar of who's got the schmanciest college to which they've been admitted.
That resonates so much. You mentioned this. It's a lot of what motivates us at Signet as well. I borrow this phrase from a parent coaching group that I really love. This is all a process of enrolling a young person in their own adulthood.
I like that.
They are practicing, they are learning, they are developing and building a foundation for whatever life that they're going to go on to lead. And when we focus too much on a specific outcome and not enough on the process of developing, we shortchange that process entirely, right? We pervert the incentives, we diffuse the motivation, we create really, really difficult family dynamics that feel entrenched. And young people don't always have the best instincts around choices, and it can lead them to make some pretty poor choices.
Well, yeah, simply put, some kids drive the car of their life straight into the ditch just to prove that it's their life.
Right. But I want to put a pin in this for a second and back up to something else here. I want to hear about your story. And how self-driven were you, and how much control did you feel you had over your education and your path?
That's a good question. I mean, with any kind of Marvel origin story, there's always kind of where do you begin? So, I don't know. So, I'm an identical twin. I grew up in a few places, but middle school and high school in rural Connecticut, up near the Mass border. Tiny public high school, maybe 100 kids in my graduating class. School was always pretty easy for me, and partly it was a small, not that intense learning environment. I almost always had the benefit of some of the really better teachers who were there. Like I'm in 53, so like a lot of people of my generation, my parents weren't on top of me about doing my homework. Both had graduated Penn State, which lovely place, but not Harvard or die kind of thing. The thing for me, I mean, I think, pretty self-driven in many ways. Because I went to a tiny public high school, I got to involve myself in every single extracurricular activity that was interesting to me because everybody needed more folks. So I had a dad who was alcoholic, eventually drank himself to death, a mom who struggled a lot with mental health in and out of some institutions, neglect. I mean, just hard. And so yeah, I mean, but I do think that, well, if I go back a minute, there's some of the research that we lean on the most is by a guy named Steve Mayer who did all the work on learned helplessness. And then the takeaway, because it's a long story and you have a short podcast, but the takeaway is that when, in this case, rodents, but also people, when they have an adverse experience where they feel a healthy sense of control, like this is really challenging and there's something that I can do to navigate my way through this. When you have that experience, it wires the brain to become really quite tolerant of stress and challenge in other situations. And so, one of the points that you alluded to in the introduction to this podcast is that when we want kids to feel that they are using this time of developing their own lives, including developing their ability to handle things, to enroll in their own lives, and to feel that they can cope with the natural challenges that are part of taking on worthy challenges, right? Of school or work or relationships or sports, music, whatever it happens to be. So I think one of the things that I think makes me marginally better at the work that I do with young people is I had some really challenging experiences as a younger person, and for either by my own wherewithal or just a lot of support or just dumb luck, was able to navigate those things successfully enough, and I love the word enough, that makes me pretty confident about my ability to handle hard things now. So that's a long, kind of long-winded Marvel origin story.
Yeah, it was so great and great of you to share it.
Yeah, thank you.
Not that you had the adverse experiences, but also great that you were able to develop a great amount of resilience from them. And I think it's such a great object lesson in what we're shortchanging a lot of kids of when we snowplow, when we try to pair the road for them instead of prepare them for the road.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great one. Love that line.
Not mine. I also paraphrased from somebody else.
Yeah, yeah, and part of someone, a former colleague of mine said, "Problems now are problems later." And, I mean, I have a 19-year-old daughter and a almost 22-year-old son, and I don't wanna see them suffer. I don't wanna see them struggle. I wanna see them have all the great outcomes, and the world be their oyster, blah, 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 blah. But I also have to remind myself that part of life is learning to handle things that are hard. And you don't learn to handle hard things unless you handle hard things. And I can't do that. I can try to do that for them and absorb all the slings and arrows for them so that they never struggle. But it's a terrible disservice because then, we talk about the self driven child, this idea of being a non anxious presence. And when we step in front and handle everything for kids, we're when depriving them of this opportunity, the Steve Mayer of, something was hard and I could handle it, and I wire my brain for that stress tolerance. But I'm also conveying to kids, perhaps unwittingly, that I have to handle this for you because I don't have confidence in you that you can handle it yourself. And even if it were a mess, or if you do make a mess, I don't have confidence that you or I could handle the emotional of the mistake that you make. And that too is a really big problem because good luck having a life where you never get your heart broken, where you never lose a job, where you never do something stupid, where you never hurt someone else, where you never screw up. I mean, good luck with that. But what we talk about in the self-driven child about doing everything we can to support kids in letting them fix their mistakes that they make and not sweep in and do them for them, because few things can be more empowering to a young person than to say, I have confidence in your ability to make decisions about your life, and that when you make mistakes, which you will because you're human and adult and training, that you'll be able to figure out how to clean up that mess and make it good enough. Because otherwise, we see, I mean, so many young people undone by anxiety. And the major manifestation of anxiety is just avoidance. So, particularly with perfectionistic kids, we see them, they don't put themselves out there into anything that's challenging because they worry if I screw it up. But if you knew that no matter how badly you screwed it up, that you could fix it, well, you're a lot less afraid.
Yeah. You're also much more willing to ask for help,
True, true.
right? They don't that's such a hard thing, I don't know if you have this, but I certainly do. It's very hard for me to ask for help. And when I do, and I get over whatever, head trash is keeping me from asking for help, when I do, I'm like, "Man, that was so great. It was so easy. I got help. I learned something. Now I know how to do it. I know that asking for help is not the end of the world." It's this whole, little opera that I go through. But, kids today, as we can say as us old folks here, kids today are really afraid to ask for help. They're really afraid to show that they don't know how to do something. And so, like you said, that they're just going to avoid doing it. And they may be missing out on things that they really want to take part in, things that might be really enriching or fun or meaningful to them. And they avoid it because they can't bear the stress of looking like they're not doing it perfectly. And that really breaks my heart.
And it's a great place for parents to model that too. I mean, the most powerful tool in a parent's toolbox is modeling. And so you can, for parents in the self-driven child, there's a sort of, I slip in a little pot shot at my wife, my much better half, who is sort of spectacularly competent at like everything you can imagine, except for ice skating, which is fantastic. And so, I pointed out to her somewhere along the line that young people can look at their overly competent parents and think of them as parthenogenic, that they just pop formed from Zeus's brow, and can't imagine that they were ever awkward adolescents or made mistakes or had bumpy paths. And so parents can take their own example from this, but we years ago when my kids were little guys, we all went skating up in a pond. We're visiting folks up in upstate New York. And I am barely passable as an ice skater. My kids had not learned. And my wife, bless her heart, is like Bambi on ice. It's fantastic. So she went out there with a kitchen stool and just as anxious as you can be. And first of all, I was laughing because I'm like, sweetheart, I know exactly what you're going to look like when you're 80 with a walker. And for my kids to see her like, oh my gosh, but here she was pushing on and making a go out of it anyway. And it's really powerful for parents to even turn around and ask their kids for help. And obviously we'll do that easily and naturally with technology. But to model that it part of life is to make mistakes, and part of life to say, Sheila, I have no bloody idea what you just said. Can you try explain that to me again? And we just normalize that behavior. If you know Louise Penny books, the Inspector Gamache series, is the four questions that lead to wisdom. One is, or four statements. One is, I don't know. Two is, I'm sorry. Three is, I was wrong. And four is, I need help. And you're right. A lot of corners of our society are so hyper individualistic that we feel like if I ask for help, I'm doing something wrong. And of course, that's not at least for me. That's not been my adult life.
Yeah. I mean, yes. And also, it's the whole point of school, right? It's the whole point of school. We're learning from other people, whether that's your teachers, your peers, whatever. At Signet, we work with a lot of students applying to graduate school. And so many of them are overwhelmed by the thought that they have to know exactly what their eventual PhD dissertation is going to be about before they even submit their application. They need to write about it. And I always try to tell them part of the writing is figuring out what are the questions. Really, we just want to get to the questions. We don't have the answers. The answers are the thing you're going to go find under the guidance of all these wonderful people in the PhD program. And you have to remember that it is a training program. School education is training. If you knew everything before you even got in, why do you need to go?
I love that. I love that.
So yeah, that's just a really important reminder, I think. But I love that you brought up the role of the parent here, because so much of what we do as parents is just try to herd these cats, get our kids to do X, Y, or Z that we need them to do. You know, my son is much younger; he's only 6, so mostly it's please just put your shoes on. Put the shoes on. I have to ask about 15 times before we can get anywhere. But, you're so right that the modeling we can do as parents is probably the most effective thing that we can do to urge them towards different choices. Let's say we can't control their behavior. We know we can't force them, but we can set examples for them that allow them to learn things and, imbibe what they will from us. One of the things in your book that you talk about is home as a safe place. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, when there are a couple things to this. One is that from a stress perspective, there's this wonderful research by a guy named Michael Meany who studied what's called epigenetics, and it's basically how does stress get passed on generation to generation to generation. And this really neat experiment, they had these rats and rat pups, which are baby rats, and they kind of from the moment they're born, they whisk them away, and these lab techs sat there and kind of handle them with latex gloves. It's really stressful. It's not life threatening, but really stressful to a baby rat. And if they gave him back to mom, and mom was a high licking and grooming rat, which is kind of the rat equivalent of there, hugs and kisses, and they did that, and then all the stress would basically flow out of them. And then they did this day after day. Oh my goodness! Oh, thank goodness! And to the point when these rat pups reached maturity, and they looked at their brains, they had this unbelievable connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the stress detecting part of the brain. And the strength of those connections neurologically is the single best marker of mental health, because you freak out and then your brain goes, wait, we've got a plan for this. I can handle this. To the point that they they nicknamed these rats California laid back rats, right? They were impossible to stress. Now, if we think about school for children, for some children, school is really easy, and and they love it and they feel validated all the time. But for many kids or most kids, that's not their experience. And especially if you're going through, I don't know, middle school, it's not just school, but it's friends and it's social dynamics and who am I? And I'm figuring myself out and my sexuality and on it goes. And all of these things take hard work and they can be threatening. And so a lot of times, particularly if school is stressful or if they've struggled with their self-control, a lot of kids hold things together at schools, and then they get home and they go blah, and they just kind of emotionally dump all of their garbage at home. And that's as it should be. It should be safe to come home and be a mess and not be your best self and be able to retreat to your room for a couple hours and then come back down and be a civilized human being. When we parents get overly anxious about anything that's not going well for our kids, instead of being a source of the solution, right, we become a source of the problem. We add energy to the problem. So in this chapter, we talk about the idea of being a non anxious presence with the idea of making home feel like a safe base. So when your kid comes home, it's just like, oh my gosh, it was a disaster. Go, oh my God, how could you screw that up? We studied for not so helpful. Not so helpful. You're certainly not high licking and grooming of your kid there. But also, if we do that repeatedly, kids will learn quickly. Don't tell dad when things haven't gone well. Don't tell mom when things haven't gone well. And there's just a wonderful piece in the New York Times this week about a trouble shared is halved, right? A joy shared is doubled. You and I have the same experience of working with kids. So how'd you do on the PCT? It was terrible. No, in 30 years of doing this, no one has ever just told me the score, right? They always editorialize on it, right? And so when they can share you a score that's wildly low compared to their expectations or their school or whatever, and you go, huh, well, yeah, my guess is you missed some stuff there that you probably knew how to do. And they're like, that's it. And they're waiting for some volcanic eruption. When we as parents, when we as educators can be less anxious and really siphon stress out of kids' nervous systems, their prefrontal cortex and all those executive functions, including the mental and cognitive flexibility to put things in perspective, come back online. And in a perfect world, the experience for any child is something that stretches them, that's kind of intense, whether the playground or school or whatever. And then they come back to mom or dad or another caregiver and kind of recover. And so it's this you foray and recover, foray and recover. So there's a story I'll share. I was giving a lecture at a local school about our second book, What Do You Say? And this mom came up to me afterwards and she's African American. This is important. I'll tell you why in a moment. And she said, I bought The Self Driven Child at 2020, the summer of 2020. So obviously the COVID going crazy, but also, if we all remind ourselves, Black Lives Matter, right? And she said, I read that book and I was hell bent that I was going to make home feel like a safe base because nothing in our life felt safe. I mean, the whole world, COVID, and with a 14-year-old son, to me, it felt like America was hunting people, children who look like my kid. And I was so I was so afraid that whole summer, and I just committed myself that I was going to make home feel safe. And she said it completely transformed my relationship with my son.
Oh, that's amazing.
And so it's hard when your kids are struggling, right? I mean, my daughter is doing beautifully now, but she was full school refusal for the last 3 months of eighth grade. The years leading up to that, really hard. The years immediately after that, really hard. And so much of our work as parents is working on ourselves, right? And look, I'm like you, I help people get into college. So what's my inner monologue? Like, what kind of a parent are you, right? I said, no, this is part of her path. This is part of her path. And obviously, as I shared about my own background, it was easier for me to have confidence that this was going to work out okay because I'd walked that myself. But I also, and any parent can do this, remind yourself that no matter how poorly things are going with your child, school, friends, life, drugs, whatever, your kid wants his life to work out day in, day out, today, next week, next month, next year. It may be a hot mess. But given how long I've done this stuff and my writing partner even longer, we see this all the time the kids who are just a disaster years later, it's like, holy smokes. I mean, I was just on another podcast with them about a kid who spent 4 years in a residential psychiatric hospital. 4 years. And he now he's a psychiatrist himself, and he runs an entire group somewhere in the Midwest, and dozens of people working for him. And you would imagine, a pretty sensitive clinician. Life has a way of working itself out.
Right, right. And trying to force someone down a path that we might know or recognize is not always the right way for them, right?
Well, that's right. And your don't force it has exactly the right energy. I was just talking to a kid, 25-year-old the other day, and he told his parents, he said, I am so grateful to you that you never had a plan for my life. It was their job to help him figure out what his plan was for his life, but it didn't come pre-stamped with, here's the plan and here's what we expect of you.
Right. Yeah, and as a child of immigrants, I think this is a thing that I really care about because they came here and they said, "Here's what your life is going to be. Do X, Y, and Z." And, my whole life has been defined by trying to subvert that plan. Every turn, that's what I tried to do. My brother, on the other hand, has done the opposite. He's done exactly what they wanted him to do.
Are you the younger?
I am the younger. I'm the younger, rebellious one.
Well, yeah, that's not uncommon.
No, right? But, my brother seems perfectly happy. I would never be happy in his life. He would never be happy in mine, and that's fine. Before I let you go, I do want you to talk a little bit about the new book because I think that kind of practical talking point of how do we actually do this? This is a beautiful idea, but how do we do this? I think that's really important to hear.
Yeah. So, I mean, so first of all, every chapter of the self-driven child ends with what to do tonight. So it's kind of like the spark notes, cliff notes of it, because there's reading all this stuff and the science of it. And then there's how do you actually make it a habit? And so that's in self-driven child. And what do you say? We give all these scenarios of the kind of things that parents always fall into about grades and technology, and on it goes, and kind of scenarios of what people might naturally say, what you might say instead. The most interesting for me, the most kind of eye-opening chapter that we wrote is called The Language and Silence of Change. And it's born of the idea that a lot of times when people are saying, how do I motivate my kid to do whatever? What they're really asking is, how do I change my kid? And the reality is, you don't change people who aren't asking to be changed. It doesn't work that way. What we talk about there, the big thing that I'll talk about here is what's called motivational interviewing. And it was a process that was developed by Stephen Miller and William Miller and Stephen Rolnick. Anyway, there were psychologists who in the 80s worked with problem drinkers. And what they found was when when we try to force help or advice, they resist the very people who are trying to help them. Ooh, and then that quickly tends to go south in terms of relationships. The insights are these: that a person who's in a hard situation is typically ambivalent about change. So we'll pick an easy one. If you've got a kid in school where things aren't going well, and you're trying to lean into them as a parent or as a teacher, saying, Ned, if you get your grades up, you'll have better choices for college, or your teachers will like you better. The kids thinking my mom and dad will get off my back. The reasons why working harder in school probably has some upside. I'll get my friggin' phone back, whatever, right? But also, there are reasons why that kid may not want to do that, right? I don't like Mr. Johnson. He's a crummy teacher. English is so boring. I'd rather be playing Xbox. Or, and this is important, especially for kids who find school hard, they could work really hard and move their grades from sucky to sucky plus. And now they know exactly the limit of their cognitive or educational ability. And that's really scary. It's much easier to say, well, if I wanted to, I could, right? And you sort of handicap yourself. And then, and because you can protect your ego that way. So here's the way out of this: we ask open ended questions, we use reflective listening, and then we wait for change talk. So the story that's in our book is kind of fun. This friend of ours is a counselor, caught wind of a girl who was smoking a ton of pot. And she came up to her, and the first thing she did is take force off the table. She said, listen, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm not going to try to talk you out of smoking pot. I hear that that's kind of a part of your life right now, and I am not going to try to talk you out of it. And that brings down the defensiveness. And she said, I am, however, I'd love to understand more about, if I may. So can you tell me kind of like, what do you get out of it? And the girl says, well, my friends are really cool. They're really funny. I feel cooler when I'm with them, feel I'm more relaxed when I'm high. And our friend uses reflective listening. She just repeats back to her what she thought she heard as a way to convey, I'm working really hard to understand your perspective. Eventually, the girl says something like, it is kind of expensive, though. And this is where it's easy to jump in as an adult. Don't do it. So, well, tell me more about that. And she says, well, I buy a couple times a week. It is kind of expensive. If you had more money, what would you do with it? And she says, I get my hair done. My friend Sheila has these really cute shoes. Back and forth it goes a few rounds of this. And then she, well, thanks for the time. That really helped me to understand where you're coming from. And they parted ways. She sees the girl a couple weeks later and she's got her hair bobbed and she like sidles up to her. It's like, hey there, your hair looks really cute. Oh, would you like it? Yeah, it looks great on you. So tell me about that. How did that happen? Oh, well, last couple weeks I decided to only buy once a week. And so I could use the money and do this. And the two biggest insights are these. One, as parents, as educators, as caring friends, we have a writing reflex, meaning if I have a problem and you see it, your brain immediately goes into overdrive. And, hey, Ned, what about this or what about that? And you start making suggestions. But if I've not asked you for help or suggestions, then I fight it. So we resist that writing reflex and instead ask open ended questions. And the most powerful motivation to help people change is for me to articulate for myself the reasons that I want to change. It's hard. And granted, if my kid was smoking pot, it'd be easier for you to step in and have that conversation with her than it might be for me because I get stressed out about it. But it's really
Yeah, there's so much emotional baggage.
but it works. I did this with a super perfectionistic kid about a month ago who had 4 administrators at her school, teachers, advisors, say, you got to drop one of these classes. And she's like, over my dead body. And she was smart enough to reason why not and anxious enough to be rigid. And I reread the chapter on this and I went at her and we had a conversation. By the end of it, she said, I really don't think I need to be in these 2 classes. And she had articulated her own reasons why. So it's good stuff.
Yeah. It's so powerful. I mean, what you've just described is our entire coaching practice, right? It's the modality of coaching, open-ended questions, reflecting back to people and letting them decide for themselves once they've articulated whether it's pros and cons or their own motivations or their own desires. They're already doing the calculus in their head. Right? And in a way, a lot of parents that hire us for coaching, they think we're gonna, like, inception these ideas. But really what it is the kid already knows. They just need someone to hold some space for them and help them articulate it and put it out there in front of them, and agree with you, it is so hard for a parent to do. It's much easier for some other sort of mentor figure to do it. Well, Ned, I think this is a good place to leave it. This has been a great conversation. I'm going to make sure the links to both of these books are in our show notes. If people want to learn more about you, where can they do that?
So self-driven child is our .com is our website, and I've got a podcast by the same name. And I made a TikTok a couple years ago that went a little viral. It was all about ADHD and procrastination. So I'm allegedly TikTok famous. So my TikTok is the other Ned Johnson.
Thanks again. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks a bunch, Sheila. I love your work.
Thank you. All right, as we wrap up here, I do want to recommend Ned's book again and that you check out his podcast, which is called The Self-Driven Child, and his new book as well. He's a fantastic content creator and, like you heard, very knowledgeable about all of these things. So check him out. And as always, I'm here if you need help as well. You can join my free parent community or reach out to me and we'll set up a time to talk. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.